This BCA report released this morning, Ross, that says it's poor planning rather than the migrant intake that's the real cause of Australia's housing crisis that's driving up inflation. Now, fair point, fair cop, I agree with the BCA in that respect, but why make a bad problem worse by bringing in 750,000 people in such a short space of time, knowing all of that, knowing how under pressure we all are?
Well, there's a real problem on either side of this argument, and that is, number one, if you don't bring the migrants in, the shortage of workers in Australia in many skilled areas is only going to get worse. And as a result of that, the price of wages will go higher. If the price of wages goes higher, inflation goes higher, your interest rates go higher and will stay higher for much, much longer. Indeed, then the economy tips off a cliff, and that's a fundamental problem. Then against the other issue is the budget this year says over the next 5 years, there's going to be 1.5 million extra people come into the country. So where do those 1.5 million people live? What transport do they use? What roads do they use? Exactly what pressure do they put on inflation in terms of their energy use? Everything else that comes with this. So, what the government says to this point is, well, actually, those people are really the catch-up because we didn't take so many people on during the COVID period. But the reality is Australia, either which way, simply has to build more housing. That means that federal and state governments have to effectively step in over the top of local governments, get more planning done, get more housing done. The infill into our sort of inner suburbs has to continue to go on at pace because right now one other fundamental problem's taken place, and that is property developers have walked away from many of our major states, including Victoria and New South Wales, because they simply can't make a dollar there if they try and put a building up. So there's your other fundamental problem with this.
Your point there, though, on migration, you're talking about 1 million people coming in and there's a pressure on workers. We've got about 1 million people on the dole, Ross, and they're already in Australia. So they're already in a home or they're already on the roads. They're already factored into our infrastructure requirements. We're adding a whole lot of people, and I take it, if you've looked over the amortised 4-year period, we would have had a migration intake roughly like that. We're trying to bring them all in 18 months. And that's the pressure point because we already know how tough it is for renters. We already know, there's a whole generation of young kids growing up now, unlike you and me, that are going to struggle to get into a home. We know we need a population of locally born Australians too. Try buying a home and raising a young family. So all of this collides at the one time. And government's job is not to make a bad situation worse. And I reckon so much that's driving this is the government wants the sugar hit in the bottom line of the budget.
There's no doubt they do because, Australia is one of the very few countries in the world with a relatively small population that can migrate its way out of its economic problems by bringing in more people. But the real issue that you raise is really interesting here, and that is many existing Australians are going to find themselves squeezed out of our capital cities. So this is then putting pressure into the regions where regional property prices are also rising right now. They're not falling, as you'd expect when you suddenly see interest rates having done what they've done. So this is, again, all causing inflation. Now, the issue is if you try and turn off the tap in terms of migration coming in, well, you're only going to make the skills shortages worse. You're right about saying you've got to train people, put them to work, but there's always natural unemployment. And do bear in mind in all of this that the Reserve Bank Governor coming in, Michelle Bullock, says she thinks the natural rate of unemployment is probably 4.25% or 4.5%, which means over the next sort of 18 months or so, there's going to be about another 170,000 people who find themselves without a job. So that's only exacerbating the problem that's going to be caused by even more people coming into the country.
Right, well, you and I know the difference between a genuine recession and a recession per capita, and that's where people, the bottom line might look good in Canberra, but people feel and they know in their homes they're falling behind. We'll come back to that next week, I reckon.
Yes.
I'm interested in your take on what's happening in WA because there was a big spike overnight in gas prices because there was a worry about Woodside workers. You tell me where I'm getting this detail right, but there's a worry about Woodside workers in WA and industrial action. What's going on?
Okay, so this is something that lands right at the heart of the federal government, and it's a big problem. So what happens, as you quite correctly say, is that gas prices in Europe, in Germany in particular, they jump by 40% overnight. So we're not talking 1 or 2%, we're talking 40% overnight. Now, they are volatile, it's fair to say, but the reason is the reports that workers at Woodside and also at Chevron on the biggest LNG projects there could be considering industrial action and strike action. They're only considering it. They haven't done it. They're considering it. These are AW workers, they're petroleum, oil industry workers. Now, even the mere threat of that caused the prices to rise because the world is in such a precarious balance since Russia invaded Ukraine and the gas supply from Russia to Europe stopped. So this is fright because the Northwest Shelf accounts for around 12% of the gas that goes around the world. And so really what you can expect is that Germany, Japan and Korea will all be ringing Anthony Albanese right now saying, you get those workers back to work, you ensure they don't go on strike. But mind you, pretty good strategy from those workers. They recognise when they've got a bargaining chip because they literally would be holding the world to ransom, especially going to a very cold European winter. So, do understand that this has got broader implications than just simply a localised strike. You're going to have the leaders of the major countries around the world ringing the Prime Minister and saying, mate, you get those blokes back to work. We cannot do without those gas supplies. Otherwise, our people are either going to go cold or inflation is going to be reignited around the world.
Wow. And of course, I'd be then ringing the unions as well because they're the ones that have got Woodside over a barrel. Ross Greenwood, thank you.